Shabbat Shalom, and we're going to begin with a blessing for studying Torah, which is over here, but I need to move it over. Here we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. And la'asok is really to busy ourselves in the words of Torah. I'm going to now share with you the text of the okay. Not what I want. Okay. Where did, oh, here it is. All right. So I assume you can see the text of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So who would like to begin to read?
Actually, Rabbi, we're seeing a different thing. We're seeing Rabbi Sachs' commentary.
I just changed it to this. Okay, let me, new share. All right, try this again. Okay, this is not what I want you to see. So you can't. Okay, let's try this again. This is so frustrating. I cannot believe it. All right, do you see it?
Yes.
Great. Okay, who would like to read? Doug.
I can read it. Just give me 1 second. There we go. It just was really small on my screen.
Oh, it's giant on my screen.
So give me just, I can see it now. Even with my glasses, I was like, I think I see words. So, okay, here we go. Do not sacrifice the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect or flaw in it, for that would be detestable to him. If a man or a woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God, one moment, and your God, in violation of his covenant and contrary to my command, has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them or to the sun or the moon or the stars in the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take the man or woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is to be put to death, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting that person to death, and then the hands of all the people. You must purge the evil from among you.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, Alejandra and Ellie. Nice to see you both. So this is fortunate because I just listened to the 4th lecture of Micha Goodman, who is a scholar at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. And he was talking about the difference between monotheism and paganism. So what is the difference? Let's talk about that for a moment. There's one very obvious difference and then some that are not so obvious. And this relates to this business about idols.
The worshiping of one God versus the worshiping of many.
Okay, that is the one clear distinction that we always talk about. But what are some other differences? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
It doesn't deny the existence of others, of other gods.
It what?
It doesn't deny the existence of other gods.
Well, actually, monolatry does not deny.
Monolatry, yes.
Yeah, monotheism does. One hasn't. Okay. Risa said one has an image and one does not. Okay, that's getting very close to what we're going to talk about. So in pagan theology, there's this idea that there is energy in nature. And each part of that energy is personified in some kind of god, little god. In our understanding, God created nature. But in paganism, nature does not really separate God from the world, because the gods are nature. So you have the god of thunder and the god of the ocean and the god of war, and you've got the god of the sun, and you've got all these different gods that personify the powers that exist in nature. Why is that important? Because the rituals that are performed in a pagan religion are meant to attempt to control nature and God, because the God and nature are sort of the same thing. And actually, he also talks about how this leads to hubris and, there's a sense of yourself that's beyond what it should be, and you'll see why. So in the pagan religion, you have magicians or priests or whatever you call them, who have rituals that they know about, and through those rituals, they attempt to control some aspect of nature, some power in nature. If you are not successful, it's not because God is more powerful than you are, it's because you didn't do the rituals properly. So the idea here is that you can have control over the forces of the universe, over gods. And of course, if you're successful, then you go, look what I did. I am able to control the god of war, or I'm able to control the god of fertility, or whatever it is. Monotheism is a destruction of magic, because God is beyond nature. God cannot be personalized in some sort of an idol. God cannot be controlled. And we've replaced rituals with prayers. And prayers, rather than trying to control, or rather than trying to give you the illusion that you can control, reminds you that you are not able to do that. It gives you the humility to understand that you are not in control. So does that make sense to people? So that's like a major difference in terms of mindset. It's not just, I always thought it was important that there was one God, because that meant there was one morality, right? One morality, not a different set for each set of gods. Also that since we are a reflection of God, that, we are all one in some sense. We are images of God, and that's all true as well. But there's this additional element that he really, pointed out and spoke to, that we are not in control. This goes along with what he's developing about the book of Deuteronomy, that it's trying to lessen the importance of rituals like sacrifices. That even though, yes, we have a temple and yes, we have sacrifices, the fact is, that's not what is most important, right? He's trying to privilege the social justice aspect of Deuteronomy. That having the temple in one place really means that you can't have all these rituals going on all over the place all the time. It's limiting where you can do it and when you can do it. But in addition to that, it's an issue of control or not control, and that I think ties into the Torah portion that is this week's Torah portion that I discussed a little bit last night, which is that we don't control or own the land, we don't control or own other people, and therefore there is a periodic relinquishing of our ownership. So people are due a certain kind of respect and dignity. And so, of course, people have land and people have their own freedom. And sometimes they have to give that up because they are in debt. And they sell themselves or they sell their land to someone else. But there's a periodic remission of these kinds of debts, a Sabbath of debts, a Sabbath of the land, just as we have also a Sabbath every 7 days. Yes, Lynn?
Except Deuteronomy at the same time sort of does indicate control by saying, if you obey all the laws, the rains will come when they're supposed to, and so on. Sort of,
yes.
At the same time, giving you an illusion of a little bit of control.
Yes. And I thought about that immediately when he came to that conclusion. I thought, I wish I could just write him an email and say, hey, what about this? So I thought about it. I thought, okay, he's really smart. He may address that eventually because there are a whole bunch of lectures, but I think the idea there is not so much, we don't control God so much. We're obeying God, which is maybe a little bit different. In other words, we're not performing a ritual to force God to do something. We're following the commandments so that God will look kindly on us. So it's a sense of control over our own lives, but it's not controlling God and not controlling nature. So I think it's a little bit different. I mean, I've had to think about that since yesterday because it was like, wait a minute. But I always tell people the whole point of the book of Deuteronomy is to have a sense that we can control things, because if we're good, we're not going to get punished. But I think it's a different kind of control that we're talking about. So we'll see if he addresses it, and I'll let you know if he does, and try to give this a little more nuance. Yes, Alejandra.
So I've been kind of scrunching because I come from this as a scholar of Native American history. So this is what I write about, what I think about, what I do. And so I read a lot about people whose belief systems are not, and I would not agree with how paganism has just been defined. I would insert like a lot of caveats to that. Because it's not about control, right? Or at least I'm thinking in the Native North American context. I'm not thinking about the Mediterranean world. Like, I'm not thinking about Greece. I'm thinking about sort of this time period in the Americas. It's about balance. And that's like intrinsic. And that's very different than control. Balance is not control. Like, you don't do a ritual and you think, I control the weather. You do a ritual, and if it doesn't work, you go, oh, something's out of whack. Maybe we've overcropped. Maybe we've done this. So it's about balance. It's not about, so the hubris, but it's not like the way, yeah. Anyways, that's what I was thinking.
That's interesting. Okay, listen, I'm sure he's not an expert on paganism, right? And it's maybe a stereotypical understanding of paganism as a way to contrast monotheism, and maybe he's talking about paganism in the ancient Near East. I don't know if that's different from Native American. I really don't know. But yeah, it's too bad he's not here and we can have a discussion with him about it. But we'll see, as I said, listen, I don't think everybody would agree with him either, that the idea of centralizing worship at the temple diminishes the importance of ritual. It's sort of a radical statement that even when I talked to my Bible professor, who's a friend of mine, she said she had to think about it. She didn't know if that really, but that's great. It's good to have a lot of different points of view, and there's probably a kernel of truth and maybe a kernel of, exaggeration. I don't know. But I wanted to point that out because we're talking here about why it's so important not to have idols. And we can say, Patty had a very interesting interpretation of the Akedah that we were studying in our Torah portion, and that was that maybe the idea here was that Abraham was idolizing his son, and God was trying to teach him not to idolize him. I mean, we idolize a lot of the wrong things: power, money, tennis shoes, whatever it is. And so that's a reason not to do it. But then he would add this dimension, I think, that it leads to hubris because we think we can control. And we think we're more powerful than we are. It reminds me of Obama saying, "You didn't build that." Well, the fact is, we are, in a sort of network of a lot of different people and things that we're maybe controlling this much. So take it for what it's worth. That's how I understood the lecture. Okay, so we're gonna, yes, Chris.
I had to figure out how to do the unmute again. I think one has to examine too how people view prayer, because if your prayer and supplication, then oh my God, it didn't happen, so I didn't do my prayer right.
Okay, so what he says to that is that if it doesn't happen, God said no. Not that you didn't do your prayer right, but for whatever reason, that was not what God wanted to do. Listen, I don't understand prayer that way. I don't understand prayer as supplication and God says yes or no. I mean, and I'm sure he's not that simplistic in his understanding of prayer, but he was talking about a soldier who had been captured by Hamas, and all these people were praying for the soldier, and he was part of it, and then the soldier got killed in the end, and God said no. That's a very problematic theology as far as I'm concerned, and I really don't believe that that's his theology. But Rabbi Richard Levy, who was One of my mentors would say the same thing. God said, no, but he did really understand God that way, that at Rosh Hashanah, you're pleading with God up on the throne to please give you another year of life. And that's not me, but we respected each other. So that's the best thing. Okay, so let's continue with, we're going to go briefly into the courts and then to the king. Okay, let me see if I squish this a little bit and maybe it'll be easier to read like this. Is that better? Oh. You know, if you don't touch something exactly the way you're supposed to, okay, I can't do it. All right, let's just, do you want to go on a little bit more, Doug?
Sure. So we're at the courts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we are. Okay. If cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God will choose. Go to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in the office at the time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they instruct you to do. Act according to whatever they teach you and the decisions they give you. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid and will not be contemptuous again.
So, you're put to death for all sorts of reasons. In fact, I have a student, Jason's son, as a matter of fact, who has a lovely passage where it says, if you insult your parents, you get put to death too, which is a little extreme. But that's actually what's interesting, Jason, is that is in his passage, but when you get to Deuteronomy and the same passage occurs, it's slightly changed. It says you have to take the kid to the elders of the city and they have to decide. So that's already a break on your ability to just turn around and kill your kid. And then the rabbis make it virtually impossible for it to ever happen.
There was that interesting part at the part we read before about how the witnesses had to be the first ones to throw the stones, which really puts a lot more intensity into the idea of whether you come forward and bring a case before somebody, because not only are you offering yourself up as putting someone in that position, but you're now obligating yourself to be the executioner, which is an incredibly hard thing. And I think, if something like that actually existed in our modern world, be an awful lot of very hesitant people to make accusations, to put yourself in that position that most of us would not want to be anywhere near.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And also, the other thing I want to point out, by the way, going back a minute, is that this business about sacrificing to God, you have to give God a perfect sacrifice with no defect. And the commentary in Eitz Chaim says that the refusal to deify nature, in other words, to make nature a bunch of gods, or to be seduced by it, should not lead us to conclude that we can sacrifice blemished or deformed animals on God's altar on the theory that God is not concerned with physical beauty. There's a whole issue about defects in here, about how priests with defects can't, serve. I mean, they can eat the offerings, but they can't serve. That's a whole big problem. But, here it's basically saying just because we don't say that, nature and God or nature and gods are identical doesn't mean we, diss God. And by the way, the other thing that I want to go back to for just a moment before we get to the courts is in Deuteronomy 16, which we kind of glossed over because we were focusing more on the judges last week. But justice shall you pursue is actually in that last chapter. That's actually that picture back there that was given to me. It's by an artist in Israel, Tzedek Tirto, given to me by Temple Sinai in Oakland when I left. And because they knew how meaningful social justice is to me. And there's, a lot of commentary about why it's justice. Why is it twice? And I mean, you can come up with a lot of different interpretations, like, well, it's so important, you have to mention it twice. Or one interpretation is that the means don't justify the ends. The means and the ends have to both be, ethical. So, and there's, many other ways of looking at that, and it's a very important verse. So I didn't want to skip that over.
And am I right that tzedek and tzedakah have the same root, right?
Yes, because
so that puts a different way of thinking about tzedakah when you think of it as a justice framed word.
Exactly. So tzedakah, even though we do translate it as charity, is not charity, because charity is based on how you feel, your heart, whereas tzedakah is a mitzvah. It is a commandment that you give tzedakah. It's not because you feel like it. It's not because you feel sorry for somebody on that one day, and then another day you don't feel sorry. You are obligated. So thank you for pointing that out. And the other thing is the fact that it says tirdof, which means to pursue. The term pursue carries strong connotations of effort, eagerness. In other words, you have to go after it. You don't just say, oh, somebody came to me and asked me, what do you think is right to do? No, I have to pursue it. I have this obligation to it. We must actively pursue it. This is Heschel. This command also means to pursue justice justly, for just goals can never be achieved by unjust means. The worthiest of goals will be rendered less worthy if we have to compromise justice to achieve it. So this is, according to this commentary, why Jews have been at the forefront of social justice struggles. So those are a couple of really important things that I didn't want to just skip over. Okay, what's interesting, anybody notice anything interesting about this business of the judges? Because we've seen something about judges before. When have we seen this? The whole system of justice. When was that first talked about?
With Jethro.
And Jethro, right? Jethro being who?
His father-in-law, Moses'
Moses'
father-in-law.
father-in-law, right? I mean, there was Moses judging all these people on his own, exhausted because there were so many issues to resolve. And who came up with the system for doing all this judging? Jethro. Do you see his name here anywhere? I mean, it's interesting that that Moses doesn't give credit to his father-in-law here for having come up with this idea. I don't know what the reason is. It could be because at this point, the Midianites, I mean, you may have well, maybe you didn't notice, but so in Exodus, okay, so Jethro or Yitro is a Midianite, right? He's a Midianite priest. Later on, if you remember the story of Pinchas, there were Israelites cavorting with women, and who were the women? Where were they from? Midianite women. And remember, Pinchas spears a man and a woman who are having sex. So somehow, somewhere along the way, the Midianites turn into enemies. So that's maybe why by the time you get to Deuteronomy, the guy's not getting any credit. I don't know. Maybe Moses wants to take the credit. There are many ways of interpreting it. You could also say, well, it's a different strand of material that was written by somebody else. Yes, that's possible, but somebody edited all this together and this is what we have. And so we have to say why, and there's never one answer, obviously.
It's interesting to me that in the Deuteronomist material, that at least in Deuteronomy, we see this case being made either subtly or not so subtly that Moses, he's going to get the raw end of the deal. I mean,
yeah,
really? You strike a rock and all that you've lived for is your adult life serving this one God? You can't go in? Where's the justice in that setting? It just, yeah. I find it interesting that he is either Moses on his own or with the help of the redactors being elevated, and I don't mean in a saintly fashion, but he is taking on his own persona of, look what I did. God, are you paying attention?
There are, of course, many explanations for why he doesn't get it to go into the promised land. But I'm just thinking all of a sudden about the reality of life. You could be working towards some incredible goal, and all of a sudden you get coronavirus or cancer or whatever it is. You know, we know there's a family in our congregation where a couple got married, and within the first year, the husband got ALS. Where's the justice in that, right? I mean, this is what life is. Plus the fact that just on a larger existential level, we never achieve our goals altogether, right? Because otherwise we'd be dead, right? I mean, the minute you think you've achieved everything you need to achieve, you're not really alive anymore. You have to keep striving to your goal, pursuing your goal, right? But yeah, it's a horrible existential fact that life is not fair. Even though God's got an intimate relationship with Moses, you'd think maybe he'd make some kind of exception for the poor guy, right? Who's worked so hard. Nope. And the Israelites don't get into the promised land at the end either, right? At the end of the Torah, it ends without them getting in. Now, yes, in the book of Joshua, they get in, and theoretically, once upon a time, there were 6 books of the Torah, and Joshua was part of it, where they actually went into the land and conquered it. But somehow somebody decided, no. We don't know why they made that decision. We can only guess that they said, yeah, happy endings are not so much what happens in life that way. Perfect ending. Because the book of Joshua is theoretically an ideal way in which the land was conquered, because in 3, lightning military campaigns, they took over the land. But then you get the book of Judges and you realize, oops, that's not in fact what happened. A lot of the places that were supposedly conquered are still under somebody else. So that's the thing about, Judaism that I love. It's all very complicated, and there's no, it may be the case in other religions. I'm not putting any other religion down. I'm just saying for Judaism, it's never a simple, here's the truth. Here's, a black and white way to look at it. Yeah, Jason.
Well, you were talking earlier about whether we feel like we're in control of things. And I guess I always just come back to the way Judaism is about actions. And it's you can certainly debate the degree to which we have free will, but we do have a lot of control over a lot of our actions. And so I see that, the idea of justice, for instance, as something that if we have it in our minds that we are aiming to pursue actions in that line, there's an awful lot we don't control. And I don't feel like we should feel responsible for things that happen, even if we've done the right thing in our own frame of, moral behavior, right? I mean, if I've acted in a way that adds justice to the world and injustice still occurs, it's not my fault or that God is punishing, I can't see it that way. I just see it as that the responsibility is on me to do my part of it as best I can, and the rest, you have to just let it go.
Yeah. It's nice if you can, right? Yeah, because Jane Veitcher was asking me, because I mentioned the other day about the sort of Kabbalistic notion of how God is influenced by us. And that seems like such a heretical idea, especially for Christians or for Maimonides or for the Greco-Roman idea about, God. But we really, don't. In fact, another thing Micah Goodman said, or maybe it was Christine Hayes. She's another scholar at the Hartman Institute. She was saying, we don't really see God as being, infallible, unchangeable. That idea that being unchangeable is perfection is not really a Jewish idea. So she was talking about the whole issue of God being angry after the golden calf episode, and Moses either doing battle with God or being invited by God to change God's mind. And God does change God's mind. And that's the way we understand God. And and we have an influence on it. So for the Kabbalists, there's always supposed to be this balance. For those of you who know the Sephirot, the sort of 10 manifestations of God that have to always be in balance. So Deen, judgment, and Chesed, compassion, always have to be in balance. But it's just not in balance in the Godhead. It has to be in balance in the world as well. And if it isn't, God is lopsided too. And that seems like again, Maimonides is very influenced by the Greeks. And so that is heretical for Maimonides. But that is, I think, really more in the mainstream. If you read the stories here, God is not this infallible, omniscient, being. God doesn't know certain things. Like God creates us and says, "Oh I made these awful people. I want to destroy them," right? And destroys everyone but Noah and Noah's family. So God made a big boo-boo, right? And as she also says, God keeps picking. Okay, we'll start with Noah, and then things will get better after destroying everybody. Nope, that's not working. Let's try Abraham. And eventually Moses and the Jewish people. And then God wants to destroy the people over and over again, right? And Moses finally says, hey, you know what? You can't do that again. You've got to just accept these people. But God created us. So what's there to accept, right? So it's a very different understanding of how God is and behaves and all of that than some other cultures. So now we are going to get to the king. King, okay. Who would like to read about the king? I know someone out there would like to. Okay, I don't want to hear crickets.
I'll continue.
Thank you, Doug.
Sorry, I could not get my unmute off. Okay. I'm having my own little issues here. All right, the king. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. You must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel.
Okay, what's the job of the king?
To write a Torah.
Exactly. The king is to sit there and write a Torah. Not to rule over people, but to write a Torah, which maybe some presidents of the United States would have done well to do that as well. What's the problem with having a king?
Well, I guess a lot of kings sort of turn into this an aggrandized and godlike creation of their own making, and force people to obey them over over a god per se. And we certainly can know in that time frame there were plenty of, Pharaoh was considered a god and such. So you would certainly want to draw that contrast, that you were not to make your king into anything other than a very humble, just like every other Israelite person, right?
So there's only one king, that guy upstairs. That's one problem. In fact, when the Israelites go to the prophet Samuel later on and say, we want a king, Samuel doesn't want to do it. Eventually, God says, okay, let them do it. They're concerned because the Philistines are attacking them. They're much more powerful, much more technologically advanced, and they feel like they need a king to kind of organize the country and organize the army and allow them to defeat the Philistines. And so then they eventually get King Saul. And before that, you had the book of Judges, where it ends with saying everybody did what was right in their own eyes, for there was no king in Israel, which somebody inserted as a way to explain that a king was needed, but it's not, you're not supposed to. But what else in here are we supposed to worry about with a king?
Well, I always wondered how the king, it says it's chosen by the Lord. The Lord chooses the king, right?
Yeah.
But how do they know? How does that person know who that king is? And then is it really chosen by the Lord?
Well, in the book
And
of
then-
Saul, there's this, they cast some lots and it's him, and so therefore that's God's choice. But I was also told by our mayor that he was appointed by God, so I'm not sure how he knows that.
And then you have that one sole person's, oh, sorry about the ringing. The one sole person's interpretate, or supposedly they receive the Torah, the commandments, or the words that they're supposed to write for the Torah.
Well, I mean, first of all, the prophet is probably going to say, this is what, God told me that you're going to be the king. So that's how you know that God chose you.
Okay.
And then this instruction, theoretically, this is, written by Moses, handed down by God on Mount Sinai, and then the king needs to make a copy of it.
And then he has to follow it for the rest of
Yeah.
the days of his life. So
That's the idea, yeah, that he would copy it and be very familiar with
but
what
he's
the
not
laws
the
are.
enforcer. That's what you
sorry?
guys were saying. You said he doesn't enforce the Torah, the rules of the Torah. So
It doesn't say it here.
right. So
You're
you're
supposed to know it,
questioning
like maybe
why-
the president should know the Constitution too.
So what was the question then?
What is a real big pitfall in having a king? What are some of the things that he might do that are problematic that it says in the text here?
You can be led astray by a variety of different,
Okay, like what?
like multiple wives, money.
Okay, so let's start with the wives. What's the problem with having multiple wives? I mean, Jacob had 4 wives, so what's the problem? Who would the wives be, do you think? Think of a king who fits this description in the Torah, in the Bible. And this was written afterwards. This was written, probably in exile after we had a bunch of kings. So I think this is a critique of a particular king who had a lot of wives and a lot of.
Are we thinking of Solomon?
Yes. Remember Solomon had, 800 wives or something? Where were those wives from?
All over the world, right?
All over the world, because one of the reasons that, Solomon foreign wives, correct, Teresa. So one of the reasons that kings marry women from other countries is because it's a way to forge political alliances, political and economic alliances, right? But then for those of you who are in my Women in the Bible class, for example, Ahab married Jezebel, right? And she had a different god, Baal. This is where we're still in monolatry, where there are more than one god, but ours is supposed to be the best and the strongest. But so we had Jezebel, who had Baal as her god. There's really nothing wrong with that. That was her god, but that was a problem for the land of Israel to bring another god in. So when Solomon had all these different wives, they brought in all these other gods, all these other gods to worship. And that's not good for the country when there are too many gods competing with each other. So you're going to have a king with many wives, and then the king is going to want to go accumulate a lot of money. And if you remember, for those of you who know the story of Solomon, he built a beautiful temple. A beautiful temple. And how do you have the money to build a beautiful temple? Where do you get the money from?
Well, you would have to tax you.
Exactly, through taxes. Okay, and he taxed people very, very heavily. And how do you get the workers to build your beautiful temple?
Well, you're going to have to make your people work.
Right, so he imposed a corvée on people. So for, I think it was a month, a year or something, everybody had to do this. It was very, very oppressive. And then when he died, and his son Rehoboam took over, people came to him and said, look, this has been really, really awful. Please, lift this corvée and these taxes and all of that. And he went and spoke to a bunch of people who said, no, do the opposite, impose more on them. So the North split off from the South. So this is the problem with having a king. You have a king who has other interests than the good of the people. The reason he built a beautiful temple, I'm sure in part was to glorify himself. So it's very problematic to have a king. And so the limits that are placed on the king in the book of Deuteronomy is he sits and writes a Torah all day. I don't think any of the kings actually did that, except maybe Josiah. Okay, so now we're going to look at what Rabbi Sachs has to say. Except, of course, now that's disappeared off my screen. All right, hang on. Somebody's going to have to teach me how to use.
Am I right that it did say shouldn't have too many wives, as if like it's okay to have a few, but not too many? It didn't cut it off at one, right? That's just, I always find that
you were allowed to have multiple wives in the Torah. That's not an issue. And in fact, it wasn't until the year 1000 that they decided having more than one, it was a bad thing. And in fact, you're still allowed to have more than one wife if 100 rabbis make it okay. And there have been people who've done that. In fact, fairly recently, there was a guy who's married and his wife didn't want to give him a divorce, so he got 100 rabbis to say it was okay to marry another woman. Okay, now.
It's interesting that the power always is in the hands of the male. Like, why don't we read about women who had 3 husbands?
No. No.
I know. It's just.
Speaking of power of the male, if a male rapes a woman, he has to marry her. Thank you very much. Which, in some ways is a protection of the female, because once, she's been raped, she's damaged goods and nobody's going to want her. But still in all, if somebody rapes you, do you really want that to be your husband? And a woman is under the power of her father or her husband, right? And she's dependent on them. And then if they're not around, her son, which is why Hagar and Sarah were so much in conflict. Whose kid was going to get the inheritance, And then if a woman makes a vow, guess what? Her husband or her father can annul it. Patriarchal religion. Okay, I think I've got the thing now. All right. Let me just get rid of this. Hide floating control. Okay. Here we are. This is, I'm going to make it smaller so it's not spread across the entire screen. Okay, how come it won't stay? Success. Very delicate. All right, you guys can all see this? Somebody, can you see this? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was the chief rabbi of England. He's not anymore, but he's a very interesting and smart guy. He's a modern Orthodox. So he says, to lead is to serve. Our Parsha, our Torah portion, talks about monarchy. When you enter the land that the Lord your God has given you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the surrounding nations, set over you a king whom the Lord your God chooses. So it should be relatively easy to answer the question from a Jewish perspective, is having a king a good thing or a bad king? It turns out, however, to be almost unanswerable. On the one hand, the Parsha does say, set over you a king. This is a positive command. Maimonides counts it among the 613. On the other hand, of no other command anywhere does it say that it is to be acted on when the people say that they want to be like all the surrounding nations. The Torah doesn't tell us to be like everyone else. The word kadosh, holy, means roughly to be set apart, singular, distinctive, unique. Jews are supposed to have the courage to be different, to be put in but not entirely of the surrounding world. I mean, to be in but not entirely. Matters are made no clearer when we turn to the famous episode in which the Israelites did actually ask for a king in the days of Samuel. Samuel is upset. He thinks the people are rejecting him. Not so, says God. The people are rejecting me. Yet God does not command Samuel to resist the request. To the contrary, God says, in effect, tell them what monarchy will cost, what the people stand to lose. Then, if they still want a king, give them a king. So the ambivalence remains. If having a king is a good thing, why does God say that it means that the people are rejecting God? If it is a bad thing, why does God tell Samuel to give the people what they want, even if it is not what God would wish them to want? Nor does the historical record resolve the issue. There were many bad kings in Jewish history. Of many, perhaps most, Tanakh says he did evil in the eyes of God. But then there were also good kings. David, who united the nation, Solomon, who built the temple, Hezekiah and Josiah, who led religious revivals. It would be easy to say that on the whole, monarchy was a bad thing because there were more bad kings than good ones. But one could equally argue that without David and Solomon, Jewish history would never have risen to the heights. Even within individual lives, the picture is fraught with ambivalence. David was a military hero, a political genius, and a religious poet, because he supposedly is the one who wrote the Psalms, which Micah Goodman pronounces as Psalms, because he's from Israel. But this is also the man who committed a grievous sin with another man's wife. With Solomon, the record is even more checkered. He was the man whose name was synonymous with wisdom, author of Song of Songs, Proverbs, and Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes. At the same time, he was the king who broke all three of the Torah's caveats about monarchy mentioned in this week's Parsha. Namely, he should not have too many wives or too many horses or too much money. Solomon, as the Talmud says, thought he could break all the rules and stay uncorrupted. Despite all his wisdom, he was wrong. Even stepping back and seeing matters on the basis of abstract principle, we have as close as Judaism comes to a contradiction. On the one hand, we have no king but you, God, right? As we say in Avinu Malkeinu, which means our Father, our King. On the other hand, the closing sentence of the book of Judges reads, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In short, without monarchy, anarchy. So in answer to the question, is having a king a good thing or a bad thing? The answer is an unequivocal yes and no. And as we would expect, the great commentators run the entire spectrum of interpretation. For Maimonides, having a king was a good thing and a positive command. For Ibn Ezra, it was a permission, not an obligation. For Barbanel, it was a concession to human weakness. For Rabbeinu Bachya, it was its own punishment. Why then is the Torah so ambivalent about the central element of its political program? The simplest answer was given by the outsider who saw most clearly that the Hebrew Bible was the world's first tutorial in freedom, Lord Acton. He is the man who wrote, thus the example of the Hebrew nation laid down the parallel lines on which all freedom has been won. The principle that all political authorities must be tested and reformed according to a code which was not made by man. But he's also the originator of the classic statement, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Almost without exception, history has been about what Hobbes described as a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Power is dangerous. It corrupts. It also diminishes. If I have power over you, then I stand as a limit to your freedom, which is what the people who are demonstrating in Michigan would say right now, right? I can force you to do what you don't want to do. Or as the Athenians said to the Melians, the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. The Torah is a sustained exploration of the question, to what extent can a society be organized not on the basis of power? Individuals are different. Michelangelo, Shakespeare, and Rembrandt needed no power to achieve creative genius, but can a society? We all have desires. Those desires conflict. Conflict eventually leads to violence. The result is the word of the world before the flood, when God regretted that God had made man on earth. Hence, there is a need for a central power to ensure the rule of law and the defense of the realm. Judaism is not an argument for powerlessness. The briefest glance at 2,000 years of Jewish history in the diaspora tells us that there is nothing dignified in powerlessness. And after the Holocaust, it is unthinkable. Daily, we should thank God and all its helpers down here on earth for the existence of the state of Israel and the restoration to the Jewish people of the power of self-defense, itself a necessary condition of the collective right to life. Instead, Judaism is an argument for the limitation, secularization, and transformation of power. Limitation. Israel's kings were the only rulers in the ancient world without the power to legislate. For us, the laws that matter come from God, not from human beings. To be sure, in Jewish law, kings may issue temporary regulations for the better ordering of society, but so may rabbis, courts, or local councils. Secularization. In Judaism, kings were not high priests and high priests were not kings. That was a separate thing until, by the way, the Maccabees, who eventually merged the two. Jews were the first people to create a separation of powers, a doctrine normally attributed to Montesquieu in the 18th century. When some of the Hasmonean rulers sought to combine the two offices, the Talmud records the objection of the sages. Let the royal crown be sufficient for you. Leave the priestly crown to the descendants of Aaron. Hasmoneans are the descendants of the Maccabees. Transformation. Fundamental to Judaism is the idea of servant leadership. There's a wonderful statement of it in our Parsha. The king must have his own Sefer Torah, and he shall read from it all the days of his life, not considering himself superior to his kinsfolk, or straying from the commandments to the right or to the left. Humility is the essence of royalty, because to lead is to serve. Failure to remember this caused what, in retrospect, can be seen as the single most disastrous political decision in Jewish history. After the death of Solomon, the people came to Rehoboam, his son, asking him to lighten the load that Solomon's projects had imposed on the people. The king asked his father's advisors what he should do. They told him to accede to their request. If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. Note the threefold appearance of the word serve in this verse. But Rehoboam ignored their advice. Actually, what he did was he went to some whippersnappers and they said, nah, impose more on them. And so the kingdom split and the nation never fully recovered. The radical nature of this transformation can be seen by recalling the two great architectural symbols of the world's first empires. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats. The Egyptians built pyramids. Both are monumental statements in stone of a hierarchical society, broad at the base, narrow at the top. The people are there to support the leader. The great Jewish symbol, the menorah, inverts the triangle. It is broad at the top, narrow at the base. The leader is there to support the people. In contemporary terms, Jim Collins, in his book From Good to Great, tells us on the basis of extensive research that the great organizations are those with what he calls a level 5 leaders, people who are personally modest but fiercely ambitious for the team. They seek not their own success, but the success of those they lead. This is counterintuitive. We think of leaders as people hungry for power. Many are, but power corrupts. That is why most political careers end in failure. Even Solomon's wisdom could not save him from temptation. Hence the life-changing idea. To lead is to serve. The greater your success, the harder you have to work to remember that you are there to serve others. They are not there to serve you. So it's a pretty powerful statement about what it means to be a leader, which unfortunately most leaders do not adhere to. I think the idea of copying a Torah scroll and reading from it every day is one way to remind yourself that you are above the law. So any thoughts about this? You know, the framers of our Constitution were very steeped in the Bible, and I'm sure this had some influence on them in terms of how do you limit the power of the executive? You know, you have to have this balance of power, which seems to be completely out of balance these days with, you know, a series of executive orders and the ability to fire people who don't please you and all of that. I don't know what's happened. I don't know. I think we've been headed in this direction for a long time, but certainly that was not the original intent. Any reactions?
I was just having a few thoughts about the context he's writing in too, in England, and you know, the history of British monarchy. And you know, you're always, when you are British, you're always a little bit deferential to the monarchy, as it's in its current role at least is ceremonial, but still technically, I think, I guess I don't know for sure, is the Queen of England still the head of the Church of England, as it was since the time of Henry VIII? I think might officially be. And you know, but it's not that far back in their history, certainly well studied, just as we go back to our forefathers. You know, the kings there were the head both as legislators and as religious figures, and that's still a very recent bit of their history. And I just know there's this you don't say anything harsh about the concept of the monarch, right, if you're from an English perspective. So I wonder how this would have been written differently by an American rabbi who wouldn't have even had to think about the context of writing about monarchy. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, that probably is definitely true. Other thoughts before we go on to the priests? Yes, Chris. Chris, you're muted.
There we go. I think about the term limits that we have for the presidency, and yet don't have term limits for Congress and other supposed leaders. And I think that plays into leading to the grandiosity of their own self, and leading to the corruption that they're talking about here. That if no limit is put on the king, and they're allowed to be the king for the rest of their life, then there's no control over them.
Yeah, well, you know, they did institute term limits here in California, which I think there are pluses and minuses to term limits, right? It does, I mean, I think it does limit, you know, how much power you can accumulate, but at the same time, sometimes you have people who actually know something about how the whole system works, and then they're gone, and then you have newbies. But you know,
well, like it could be, you know, maybe the length of term limits, but when we see people on the Supreme Court who get appointed when they're 35 years old, and we have people that stay for the next 50 years.
Right.
Look at people who are in Congress for 30 some odd years. You know, maybe 8 years in legislative positions is too short. So maybe looking at something different, but the point I'm trying to make is that the king, it doesn't talk here about how long the king is to be a king. It says, okay, you're going to have a king. Are we going to change that up when we move to a new town as we travel? Are we going to trade off? History shows us that the king would stay in power for the rest of their life, but there's no talk about that.
Right. Well, they're trying to put some limits on the king here, but clearly once there was a real king, I don't think David and Solomon spent their time copying Torah scrolls. I don't really think David spent time writing Psalms either, but that's another story. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to look at the priests. And this is also different from the book of Leviticus and Numbers. Now, again, Jason's son has an interesting Torah portion. It's Mishpatim, so it's got all these different laws in it. So it relates to a lot of what we have here. And that's about sacrificing the firstborn of any of your herd, your flock, your fruits, and your first son is, Jason wrote, if you have 800 wives, it's hard to have time for reading and writing. True, that could take up all your time, exactly. Thank you. So, yeah, so the firstborn son, you don't sacrifice, but you have to redeem him because he is supposed to be dedicated to temple service. And we were talking about this the other day, and I'm not sure like what the origin of this is, because maybe once upon a time, all of the first sons did serve as priests of some kind. But certainly by the time Moses came along with Aaron, I mean, it was Aaron's sons who served as the priests. And so there was no real need to give your son up for temple service, although there are people who did do that. I mean, Samson being one of them. His mother was another barren woman who said, if I have a son, I will dedicate him to the temple service. And he became a Nazirite for life, which you're not supposed to do. You're only supposed to do it for 7 years. You know, everything's 7 years. You know, land, it's 7, always 7. So here, it's a slightly different group of people who are going to serve as the priests. So now I have to call up the, hang on. Okay, got it, and now I'm going to share it. Okay. So this is the priests. Does somebody want to read? Jason, you want to read it?
Okay, hang on. I just have to move my videos to the other side of the screen. The Levitical priests, indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. They shall live on the food offerings presented to the Lord, for that is their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. This is the share due the priests from the people who sacrifice a bull or a sheep, the shoulder, the internal organs, and the meat from the head. You are to give them the first fruits of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the first wool from the shearing of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. If a Levite moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose, he may minister in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who serve there in the presence of the Lord. He is to share equally in their benefits, even though he has received money from the sale of family possessions.
I love the way they have an ad for Kraft salad dressing right next to this, as we're talking about the kinds of things we get to eat from, as priests. So here, it's not just Aaron's sons who serve as priests, it's the whole tribe of the Levites. It says, Deuteronomy differs significantly from the earlier books of the Torah with regard to who may be a priest and what the public is required to give the priests. It considers not only the descendants of Aaron, but all Levites to be eligible for the priesthood, and it assigns them portions of sacrificial animals and first products that are different from those assigned by Leviticus and Numbers. Modern scholars view these differences as reflecting the practices of various periods and places in Israelite history. So we know that the Levites don't have any land. They're the one tribe that has no land, and so we are obligated. A lot of what we bring to the temple as offerings to God are actually food for the Levites. And I don't think they had Kraft dressing in those days. Okay.
But the rest of the animal, the people would take home?
The shoulder, you're together.
They would give that part to the priests, and then after the sacrifice, they would keep it?
let's see, it says, refers to the portions legally assigned to the priest as their entitlement, namely portions of the sacrifice of well-being and the first product. Because some of these endowments are from sacrificial animals, it is clear they are given only to Levites serving as priests, not to all Levites. Well, I think actually the rest of it is actually sacrificed to God. So a lot of what is brought to the temple, there's some, like the Olah, which is completely burned up for God. But then I think other sacrifices, there are portions that are given to the priest for food, and then other parts are sacrificed to God. So for example, the fat, you're not supposed to eat the fat at all. That definitely goes to God. And there was a certain, if you go back to Leviticus and you look at the offerings, they explain how to lay on the altar the different parts of the animal in a particular order. Yeah. And then it says here, the priest also received the first products of the farmer and the herdsman, namely the first grain, wine, and oil, and the first wool. Giving the first products to the priest is tantamount to giving them to God. The endowments, food, drink, oil, and material for clothing are often mentioned in ancient Near Eastern legal texts as the basic necessities that people supported by others must receive. Okay, so that's really pretty much. Any other questions or comments about the priests? Now we're going to get to, I mean, these titles, occult practices and all that, were put in by the Christians. This is not from the Tanakh itself, but it's a decent translation. Okay, Jason, you want to continue?
Sure. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you will dispossess listen to those who practice sorcery or divination, but as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die. The Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed.
Okay, so
that's problematic, isn't it? Because sometimes the prophecy is, you need to do this, or God will do that, right? Like I'm thinking of like Jonah, right? He was saying repent or God will destroy, and you couldn't wait until God did or did not destroy. The whole point was you had to repent first.
Good point. Well, the prophet's role really ended up being, a warning to people about how to behave, or an admonition about what they were doing. So it wasn't so much about predicting the future. But you're right. If that's the test of what a prophet is, it's pretty hard to, the prophet's saying you're going to die in 5 days. Okay, then you die, and okay, now I know he was a real prophet. So it's definitely a problematic thing. But the fact is that there were prophets were actual, like, they had a role in society. It wasn't some lunatic walking around, saying, the world is coming to an end. The idea here is that God is going to appoint a prophet to continue to guide you out of concern for you. And it says here that Deuteronomy strengthens the authority of the prophet by affirming that he or she is the successor of Moses and the only legitimate channel of communication with God. This is in contrast to what Deuteronomy states of the king, whose power is limited. And obviously, going to some sort of sorcerer and trying to get magic performed, which we talked about before, is not okay. It says in the actual laws of, the Jewish laws, the Torah prohibits such occult sciences as fortune telling and Satanism. Magic for purposes of entertainment is permitted. So our friend Howard Rubin, when he does magic for our congregation, is not doing something terribly blasphemous. Or when Fishman, what's his first name? I can't read.
Irv
Fishman. Yeah, he used to teach magic tricks to the kids in the morning during religious school. And then one of his great students was Sean Lester Wilson, who performed some magic for his bar mitzvah. So he was not doing something blasphemous in the sanctuary. And it says, one who consults ghosts, one who inquires of the dead, these are mediums, practitioners of necromancy, who act on the assumption that the spirits of the dead know hidden things in the future and can reveal them to those who know how to contact them. You're not supposed to do this kind of stuff, but guess what? Saul does. Saul does a lot of naughty things that he's not supposed to do. And then the idea of, the thing about putting your son to the fire is either putting them to the fire as in sacrificing them, or just that there might have been some kind of ritual where you would walk through the fire carrying a child. But you're not supposed to do any of those practices. These are all things that were done by the surrounding people. And again, this is a way to strengthen the Israelite identity. So let's see. Yeah. So God promises to show enduring concern for Israel by sending them prophets. In the Bible, a prophet is not someone who tells the future. So even though that seems to be the test, it's not what a prophet actually does. Stealing knowledge from God and sharing it with the people. A prophet is someone who tells the truth. The prophet does not tell us what we want to know, but rather tells us what God wants us to know, reminding us of our covenantal obligations. The prophet is a person who sees the world with the eyes of God, who holds God and man in one thought at one time at all times. That's Heschel. Now it says here, the passage intimates that a true prophet is one whose predictions come true, whereas the utterances of a false prophet do not. Centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah offered a more thoughtful distinction. If the message is painful for the prophet to utter and painful for the people to hear, it is likely authentically from God. So the greater the pain of the prophecy, the more likely it is true. But if prophetic words are popularly received, we have reason to doubt them, and the prophet would have reason to doubt the authenticity of the message as well. So it's not so much about predicting the future, but about telling truth. And which is why we talk about the role of a rabbi as being prophet and priest, because the prophet tells people things they may not want to hear. The priest is more someone who is maybe pastoral. And there's always a balance that needs to be reached between the two. Because if you're purely prophet, all you do is alienate people in the end, really. And, it's not a very effective thing to keep telling people how awful their behavior is and how, I would be a very popular rabbi if I did that. And also, of course, I have to always recognize the fact that I'm just as guilty as anybody else. It's not like, hey, look at me, how great I am. Okay, so any words about prophets or priests? Yes,
well,
Jason.
It's funny the way you phrased that, because I was reminded I had an interesting conversation with a guy I studied Musar with once, and he said he had gone to yeshiva, and Musar was a bad word there, in that it was used as a verb where people would say, don't Musar me, where it was like, stop trying to tell me how to be a better person, stop trying to pick on all my bad traits. So context is incredibly useful, right?
Yeah.
The way in which you receive the idea of something, can twist the word. I mean, you were talking about telling truth. For some reason, what popped into my head was in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, we have that character, the soothsayer, which translates to truth teller. and he's really a person who does divination of some sort, right? But he tells Caesar what's going to happen, and he's right. And but just the idea that we would call someone who was foreseeing the future a truth teller in our language, it's all just a matter, and of course that takes place in that time too, but it's words can easily obscure what we're trying to get at here. We're not necessarily looking for prophecy, right? We're looking for some sense of guidance. We're looking for some sense of, is the thing we're doing, are we doing the right thing, or are we doing the wrong thing? And how do we know? And what do we look to for that? We don't look to a prophet, right? No.
Who do we look to?
Sometimes each other.
And who are modern day prophets, by the way, do you think? You think there are?
Well, celebrities think they are.
They think they are, yeah, that's really scary. I mean, I thought of Elie Wiesel as a prophet. I mean, or now I'm blanking on the name of the North Carolina pastor. I see his face. I can't think of his name. Did the Moral Mondays? Anybody remember his name? Okay, blank. I'm gonna look it up right now.
We were talking recently and on Zoom about something actually related to this, which is, as we look at modern society and we look at the culture wars and we look at all these different directions that we find ourselves being pulled in, the role of the media, the left, the right, the center, all these different components, who are the prophets? And that's such an interesting question, because it was mentioned, pop stars, music, different cultural figures, but we also have within, influencers that we have within our social media platforms, who others, similar to the political arena where you have lobbyists, influencers are there to influence based upon specific drivers, whether for a message, whether it's to sell something, whether it's to sell an idea, whether it's to sell a product. And then those influencers wind up in turn influencing. And then at the end line, people think it's truth. And people feel that truth has been told. And then they further this component. And it's such an interesting aspect. Again, my basis is as a linguist. So I look at it from a language perspective of how language can ultimately wind up reframing even the original context upon which people were originally having that discussion, and how much that influence winds up coming down to the end where somebody says, it's the truth. I've heard this from so many different people. It is the truth. And then you'll have somebody else who says, oh no, I've heard this all too. And that's not the truth. This is the truth. And it's interesting to me as we're discussing this, because I feel that there's so much relevance in our modern world as it relates to truth and who's the prophet and what's the prophecy and what's the word, and the truth component that comes up through that.
I'm sure there are people who think Rush Limbaugh is a prophet, but yes, absolutely. Teresa, thank you. Yes, it's William Barber, Reverend William Barber. And as far as I'm concerned, he's a modern day prophet. I mean, it's somebody who's willing to call attention to, maybe it's not truth, there's no such thing as truth with a big T, but call attention to a situation in the world that has to be addressed in some way or another. And he's got a whole campaign to deal with poverty and inequality and all of that. Somebody put Cuomo, Cornel West maybe. Cuomo, I don't know. I'm not sure I would put Cuomo in that category. Politicians are problematic people as far as, thinking about them as having pure motivations. But I think somebody, you talked about artists. I think there are artists who are definitely prophets. I think there are people, a really wonderful, wonderful book that everybody should read is The Prophets by Abraham Joshua Heschel. That will really give you another perspective on prophets. But it's people who see something that has to be said. It's very, and in fact, this business about the pain here, it's a painful, painful process to recognize that there's something out there that must be dealt with on an ethical basis. And it's not so much, I don't know. I mean, again, truth is such a complicated category, but let's say there, poverty, let's just say, or inequality, racial inequality. I mean, somebody who can really call attention to that and who feels profoundly how unjust it is. It's not an intellectual. I mean, prophet is not an intellectual. It's somebody. It's like it's like in their gut. I mean, how do you judge someone as a prophet? I mean, obviously in the Bible it would be someone appointed by God and whatever. But I think in terms of anybody beyond that, I think we'd have to. It's probably subjective to some extent. And again today, some people we might consider to be a prophet, someone else might consider to be a crazy person. The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. Absolutely, yeah. I think actually this business about pain is really actually very apt, because they feel the injustice. It's like it's slamming them in the head. That's how, I don't remember Heschel's exact metaphors, but it's where, and I don't have my book here, of course, but where some injustice for us would be kind of problematic, for them it's searing them, so, and I guess because it's so powerful for them, they have to tell you. But they're not people that RBG, maybe. I keep my little RBG doll upright on my table at the office. I don't want her to fall over. So they're not easy people to live with, right? Because they're not people who compromise. And unfortunately, the reality, and that's what politics is all about, is that you have to do some compromising, because not everybody sees the world in the same way, and not everybody wants the same thing. And prophets are not people who are going to go, well, okay, let's, we're going to bargain. No, they have to be balanced out with other powers in the society. But they had a real role in ancient Israel, and they would say truth to power, right? I mean, they would go to King David or whatever king and say, you are that man, right? When David recognized that somebody had done something really wrong, and Nathan says to him, you are that man. And David realizes that, he must repent. I don't know how much he learns from the experience, but at least he repents at the moment. So we don't have it as an official position anymore, but, and did the kings listen to them? Not always, almost never. And a lot of prophets got put into prison because, hey, we don't want to hear this, right? Okay, so next time we will move on with chapter 19. And then chapter 20 is very interesting, because chapter 20 is the code of war and how one must conduct oneself in a war situation. So I think that has influenced how the IDF works as well, because it's a really important chapter. So we'll have next weekend is Labor Day weekend, right? It isn't? It's the weekend after? I thought it was the
Memorial Day.
Yeah, Memorial. That's what I meant. Okay, a 3-day weekend, but I don't think anyone's going away, right?
We hopefully are not still doing this on Labor Day, but we probably will be.
Oh my God, yeah. I told you the Unitarian Universalist Church put out a guidance saying that we're going to have to do virtual meetings and services until May of 2021. So anyway, yeah. So next weekend, Memorial Day weekend, right? We're gonna look at this, and then we'll probably have about 2 more sessions after that. I'm gonna be going away. Well, going away. What am I talking about? Away from this. Actually, I'm taking off some time because I have a couple weeks coming to me in a month, so I'll be gone for about 6 weeks. Somebody said to me, "Where are you going?" And I was like, "Where am I going?
Living room.
Backyard." I'm not going anywhere, but anyhow. Okay, let me see if there's anything else in the chat that we should talk about. Okay.
We'll just think of it as your Jubilee month.
My Jubilee month, right. Okay, guys, have a good Shabbat and a good weekend, and see you soon.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.